You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 327, Continental Instability. We last left the main Continental Army under General Washington in episode 324. The officers were on the verge of mutiny as they came to believe that Congress would never give them all the benefits they had been promised for their sacrifices, and that they would probably be sent home as paupers, many facing debtor's prison for the debts they had incurred to further the cause of liberty. Only General Washington's speech at Newburgh in March of 1783 prevented a likely uprising of the army. Congress itself, of course, was broke and deeply in debt. It had no way to repay its debts, since its delegates would not agree on any real taxing authority, and the states refused to come up with a way to provide funds needed to pay off the debts to the Army and to everyone else who had lent Congress money over the years to further the cause of independence. Superintendent of Finance Robert Morris had submitted his resignation, effective at the end of May 1783. His abilities to create money from nothing had been pushed beyond all reasonable limits. He told Congress that finding any solutions to its financial problems was simply beyond his abilities at this point, and that they were going to need to find someone else. Of course, there was no one else. Producing gold and silver from promises simply was not a thing that anyone could do. Morris was one of the most skilled financiers in North America, perhaps in most of the world at the time, and he could not continue to run the economy on nothing. Despite the lack of any money, the war was over, and Congress had to send home the army. General Washington informed the delegates that a bare minimum of 3 months' separation pay had to be provided, if only to give the soldiers some traveling money to get home. In April, weeks before Morris's departure, the delegates came to him and told him he needed to come up with this necessary money before he left. Morris, of course, was still struggling to come up with the 1 month's pay that he had promised the Army back in January. Covering 3 more months' pay would require raising about $750,000 from nothing. Morris said that he simply could not do this. He told the delegates that he could not, in good conscience, issue more promissory notes that he knew would never be repaid. Congress formed a committee headed by Virginia delegate Theodoric Bland to pressure Morris into finding a way to pay off the Army so the soldiers could go home. Also serving on this committee were 2 men we know pretty well, fellow Virginian James Madison and New York delegate Alexander Hamilton. The delegates pressured Morris to remain in office long enough to figure out a way to cover the 3 months' pay for the Army so they could go home. Morris finally relented and agreed to stay on the condition that Congress understand this was the very last thing he was going to do. Morris knew that the only way to create this money was to print more paper Morris notes. He would have to sign each note, guaranteeing his personal promise for repayment of the notes. Next, the delegates had to decide what to do with the Army itself. Most of the soldiers had enlisted for the duration of the war. Since the peace treaty had arrived and the enemy announced cessation of hostilities, that meant to most people that the war was over. Soldiers had already made it clear that they were not happy to just sit around in camp, starving, without adequate clothing or shelter, just waiting for Congress to decide when they could leave. Now, there was also still a large British army in New York. If the Continental Army went home, there would be nothing to confront them if the British commander, General Guy Carleton, decided to do something. More likely than the British regular army doing something, there was also the danger that loyalists who were still in New York with the British might come out and do some harm to the surrounding region. Congress debated the matter in April, and they agreed that the war was not over until both sides ratified the final treaty, and that really didn't happen until sometime in 1784. At the same time, they had to begin the process of at least reducing the Army and sending some men home. Congress authorized Washington to issue mass furloughs. This would allow the men to return home, although not formally ending their service. It would allow them to be recalled to service if the need arose. Furloughed units would, in large part, march home in their units with guns and uniforms. The biggest source of delay was that the promised 3 months of separation pay was not forthcoming. Morris had agreed to print the money, but he couldn't even get started because he couldn't find enough paper in Philadelphia to print the notes that he had to make to pay the Army. And despite the lack of separation pay, Washington announced furloughs in his general orders of June 1st. The men were to prepare to go home, while paymasters would remain in camp to help settle accounts. Officers would march their men home in units, and this was done primarily to keep order and prevent thousands of starving and impoverished men armed with guns from descending on the population while trying to find their way home. The Maryland line was the first to leave camp on June 5th. Major Thomas Lansdale tried to find a route home that would avoid most of the small towns and villages to prevent looting by his soldiers. The New York and New Jersey lines left the following day. These men had the shortest travel home. After that, New Hampshire left. Massachusetts, which had the largest contingent in the Army, mostly left on June 8th. By June 13th, Washington's army of 10,000 men had been reduced to about 2,700. Many officers were particularly upset. General Horatio Gates had already left, leaving General William Heath as the senior officer after Washington. He submitted a complaint on behalf of the officers that were being sent home without any of their promised back pay or benefits. General Washington understood their concern. He responded that he would make the furloughs voluntary. Any officers who wanted to remain in camp as they waited for Congress to make good on its promises were free to do so. Similarly, enlisted men who wanted to remain could agree to trade places with a soldier who had not yet been furloughed. On June 12th, the Maryland line arrived in Philadelphia on its way back to Maryland. There, the soldiers finally received some good news. Morris had managed to print at least some of the separation pay that had been promised, so these soldiers received their 3 months' pay. It was simply paper, meaning that when they spent it, they might get only 40 or 50 cents on the dollar, but at least it was something. The problem started when the men of the Maryland line bunked overnight in Philadelphia and had a chance to speak with other Continental soldiers who were stationed in Philadelphia. The soldiers learned that the Maryland line had been offered furloughs and were provided with the pay they had been promised in January, as well as separation pay from Congress and additional pay from the Maryland legislature. The soldiers stationed in and around Philadelphia were not part of General Washington's immediate command in New York. They had not been offered furloughs. They had not received a single penny of separation pay, nor even the pay that they had been promised back in January. This differential treatment among Continental soldiers was particularly galling to them. A group of non-commissioned officers sent a protest letter to Congress demanding to know why some soldiers were getting pay and furloughs while their units were not. Congress didn't even know how to respond to this, and didn't. A few days later, somewhere between 80 and 100 soldiers who had been stationed in Lancaster, which is about 80 miles west of Philadelphia, began marching to the city to, quote, obtain justice. Concerned about the Army marching on the Capitol, Congress asked the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania to turn out the militia and stop the mutinous Continentals before they arrived in the city. The council refused. Council President John Dickinson informed Congress that the militia was not inclined to defend Congress against the Army and actually might be more inclined to join them. The council's secretary at the time was Major John Armstrong. You may recall we discussed him a few weeks ago. He had been General Horatio Gates' aide-de-camp a few months earlier, and he was the author of the angry letter at Newburgh that forced Washington to put down a near mutiny among his officers. Now a civilian, Armstrong remained sympathetic with the soldiers who were simply demanding that Congress keep its promises to them and were feeling the same things that Armstrong himself had felt as an officer in Newburgh just a few months earlier. On June 20th, the mutineers entered Philadelphia and surrounded the State House, what we today call Independence Hall. Congress remained inside with no one to defend them. Over the next few days, more soldiers joined the protest. The crowds around the State House grew to nearly 400, and most of these soldiers were, of course, there with their muskets. The mutineers did not engage in any violence. This was simply a protest. They wanted Congress to act, and they were there to demand it. Delegates were free to come and go, although they were subject to soldiers yelling at them and harassing them along the way. At one point, President Elias Boudinot was followed home by a group of armed soldiers who he said acted in a threatening and intimidating way, but they did not physically assault him or hinder him in his walk home. While there had been no violence yet, members of Congress had no idea how long it was going to remain that way. They attempted to negotiate with the mutineers, but they were simply unwilling to accede to their demands, especially since it would probably only encourage more mutinies if they did. Alexander Hamilton, a former officer himself, tried to get the men to stand down. Hamilton's efforts at negotiating with the mutineers led to rumors that he had instigated the mutiny in order to put more pressure on Congress. Just to be clear, though, there has never been any evidence to substantiate the idea that Hamilton encouraged these protests in any way. President Boudinot sent word to Washington that they were facing a mutiny of the Pennsylvania line and had no one to protect them. Washington, of course, reacted quickly, sending Major General Robert Howe with 1,500 men from his camp in New York. This was more than half of the remaining army that was there at the time. Now, it took days for word to reach Washington and for the relief army then to reach Philadelphia. By the time the soldiers arrived, Congress was gone. Pennsylvania's President John Dickinson had advised Congress to adjourn from the city, and that's exactly what they did. The delegates voted to adjourn and resume their session in Princeton, New Jersey, leaving the mutineers behind. And with Congress gone and word that Washington was sending an army to suppress the mutineers also dispersed. Two of the officers who had led the mutiny, fearing the consequences of their actions, simply fled. They got on a ship bound for Ireland and left the country. Following the departure of those two leaders, most of the other mutineers either surrendered or tried to go back to their bases where they were subject to arrest. But the protest itself had ended. Most of the mutineers, when all of this was done, were granted furloughs and sent home. Several of the leaders who had remained would be arrested and prosecuted. There were a number who were convicted and found guilty, and some even sentenced to hang, but all of these men would eventually be pardoned. Congress, however, was in no hurry to return to Philadelphia. It was not just the mutiny, but the fact that the Pennsylvania government did not seem to want to lift a finger to protect them during the crisis. Some delegates believed that top officials in Pennsylvania may have even encouraged the mutiny in order to encourage Congress to act on several important matters. When President Boudinot ended the session in Philadelphia on June 24th, he told the delegates that Congress would resume business in Princeton on the 26th. Most delegates could not move that fast, so it took until June 30th until they had a quorum to do any business. Now, Princeton, of course, is much smaller than Philadelphia, leaving many delegates struggling to find room and board in the town. At that time, it was mostly a college town. The College of New Jersey, later called Princeton University, was very much in operation at the time, with students attending class alongside delegates meeting in Congress. Congressional Secretary Charles Thompson complained about the odor coming from the student dorms that he had to pass each day on his way to Congress. Congress met in Nassau Hall, the school's main building. President Boudinot was from New Jersey and had been a trustee at the college for some time. His colleague and former delegate to the Continental Congress, John Witherspoon, was president of the college, and the school agreed to make available whatever space Congress needed. Congress passed a resolution formally moving its meeting place to Nassau Hall and made Princeton the new seat of government. For General Washington, the mutiny was just another sign that he was losing control. At the time the mutiny started, Washington had been working on a circular to the states, arguing that they needed to maintain a strong union and that a standing army, now that the war was over, was absolutely critical. Having the Continental Army threaten the Congress and chase it out of Philadelphia was not helping him to make his case about retaining a standing army. The conventional wisdom of the time was that standing armies in peacetime were tyrannical and threatened the operation of a civilian government. The Philadelphia Mutiny played directly into that fear. So Washington had to backpedal and downplay that concern. He noted that this was not the army going after Congress. It was a few bad apples. Washington noted that it was in fact the Continental Army that put an end to the mutiny in the end. Washington also characterized the mutineers as raw recruits with little military experience, and of course that it was a relatively small number of men. In July, the Continental officers received some welcome news. Congress in Princeton had completed its approval of lump sum payment to officers in lieu of a pension, their back pay, and reimbursement for rations and uniforms that they were promised but had never received. Continental Paymaster John Pierce was tasked with making the final payoff, which totaled about $11 million. Of course, there was no actual money to make these payments. Instead, Pierce offered settlement certificates to each officer. This was essentially a paper IOU from Congress with the specific amount that they owed to the individual in question. Unlike the Morris Notes, which were backed personally by Robert Morris, these so-called Pierce Notes were simply backed by the promises of the Continental Congress to make good on them someday. The nominal values of these certificates were pretty substantial, though. Lieutenants received around $1,500, generals received nearly $10,000. Even so, without any credible backing, the Pierce Notes were mostly sold off at a very deep discount. For many years afterward, the notes were used as a medium of exchange, always traded at a deep discount to face value, based on the recipient's belief that Congress might someday make good on them. Even after receiving their pay, much of the remaining army had to stay in camp, awaiting final departure of the British Army from New York. General Washington, however, thought that the immediate crisis was under sufficient control that he could take a short departure from camp. In August, Washington visited upstate New York, going to Albany, Saratoga, and Ticonderoga. This gave him the first opportunity to visit some of the battlefields that had contributed to the success of the war, and of course, which he wasn't a part of. Always the businessman, Washington saw that valuable land in the Mohawk Valley, which had been the target of Loyalist and Indian attacks for most of the war, was selling for much less than it would be worth in peacetime. He and Governor George Clinton formed a land partnership to purchase over 4,000 acres along the Mohawk River. When Washington returned to Newburgh, he found requests from Congress in Princeton that he move down to be with them. I suspect Congress remained concerned about future mutinies and wanted the general close by. Now, Washington wasn't inclined to rush down to New Jersey. His wife Martha, who was with him in camp, had come down with a fever, and Washington was also concerned about leaving the bulk of this remaining army without his presence for an extended time. The army had to remain near New York. Although no one expected the British to go on an offensive, there were loyalists in New York who might cause trouble if there was not an army present to discourage them, and Washington wanted to remain with his army. Even so, continued pressure, and after Martha was feeling well enough to travel, Washington left Newburgh and moved his headquarters to Princeton by the end of August. The general received spacious accommodations, taking possession of a large 320-acre plantation just south of town named Rocky Hill. With a much smaller army to command and being separated from the large contingent that still remained around New York City, Washington had stepped away from the day-to-day burdens of command. He spent much of his time dining and talking with members of Congress. He attended many functions in his honor and even went to a commencement ceremony at the college. He sat for a portrait and a bust of himself, and Congress even voted to pay for a statue of Washington that would someday sit in front of the legislature. Witnesses who had seen Washington in command of the army at earlier times during the war and had the opportunity to interact with him in Princeton noticed a great change. With the pressures of command mostly gone, Washington was able to relax. Observers noted that he smiled much more often and even showed some elements of wit and humor, a countenance rarely on display during the war. Like all other officers and men who had served in the field for so many years, Washington was simply ready to go home. He corresponded with his staff at Mount Vernon, hoping to put the house in shape for his return. He hoped that Congress would come up with some of the funds it owed him for his expenses during the war. He had provided his country with a valuable service that was coming to an end. Washington simply wanted to go home. Next week, we're going to take a look at what some people describe as the last battle of the Revolutionary War. The British face an enemy force in Cuddalore, India. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Curtis Johnson, Chasen Harrison, and Anthony McGinnis. I also want to thank Deborah Will for a generous one-time gift via Venmo. To everyone who continues to support this podcast, thank you very much. Now, this week's topic, the mutiny and the decision by Congress to flee Philadelphia, is just another indication of how badly the transition from war to peace was really going. Congress was unable to provide the Army with just about anything it had promised them during the war, when everything would have been lost but for the steadfast efforts of the Army. The unwillingness of the states to do anything about taxes to pay the government's bills, to me, seems downright embarrassing. I get that no one likes to pay taxes, but when you've asked men to sacrifice during the war with promises of repayment, those promises really do have to be forthcoming. This was one reason why many monarchists at the time thought a republic would never work. They believed the leadership and guidance of a king was necessary to ensure officials did their duty and acted in the long-term national interest. It's easy to understand why the soldiers were angry. The terrible treatment they experienced, with Congress unable to provide the most basic support, left them as virtual beggars. I've heard some people describe these soldier protests in 1783 as an attempted coup, but that's really not the case. The angry soldiers who marched on Philadelphia really only wanted what other soldiers had already been offered, and they were simply protesting. They weren't making any efforts to shut down Congress or use military force to somehow replace the government. One of the reasons that the Pennsylvania government gave for not calling out the militia, aside from the fact that the militia might refuse to turn out or might even side with the protesters, was that they argued that what was happening was not really a big deal. Men protesting for what they were owed seemed pretty legitimate to them. In discussions where members of the Continental Congress were discussing with Pennsylvania officials how to react to this mutiny, the Pennsylvania officials said they might be inclined to take action if the soldiers did something violent, but their coming to Congress to seek promised payments seemed like a pretty legitimate petition of grievances. Now, the big reason that Congress ended up leaving Philadelphia had to do more with the fact that the Pennsylvania government seemed to support the protesters. They didn't leave because of the protests themselves, but because Pennsylvania's reaction to the protests disturbed Congress. The fact that Major Armstrong, who had been an advocate for the soldiers to engage in just this sort of activity before he took his job with the Pennsylvania Supreme Council, is one source of pretty clear sympathy with the protesters. Many of the elected officials, of course, were also former soldiers who appreciated the protesters' concerns. It's also important to note that the protesters were not just enlisted men. They were being led by officers. It wasn't just the lower ranks getting angry. The officers were just as upset as the enlisted men. And this continued existence of a command structure among the mutineers probably helped to keep things calmer than they might have become. When one soldier threatened President Boudinot, a sergeant shut it down and personally apologized to the president. When two of the captains of the mutineers heard about some bad behavior, they also visited Congress and provided written apologies for their men's behavior. These were clearly not the actions of men trying to overthrow Congress. They were men trying to present an opinion in a peaceful way as they possibly could. Now, after Congress fled the city, President of Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, went in person to lecture these mutineers for their bad behavior and personally told them that he would recommend pardon if they returned to their barracks. And as I said in the main show, almost all of the soldiers complied and returned to duty. During the 2-week mutiny, there were no deaths, no injuries, no property damage. At the end of the day, though, soldiers just don't have the right to walk away from duty. Remember that the Army had shot mutineers in the past. Several courts-martial were held in July that tried a number of the leaders. 3 of the top officers who were involved were acquitted, though. 2 sergeants were found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. Several other soldiers were sentenced to be whipped. However, on the request of the Pennsylvania officials, as Dickinson had promised, they sought pardons, and pardons were granted for all of the men who had been found guilty of anything during the mutiny. I did mention that 2 of the officers who were leaders in the mutiny had fled to Ireland, Captain William Carberry and Lieutenant John Sullivan. Both men returned home within a year, and they both applied for back pay, and at that time were arrested for their role in the mutiny. These men were eventually released and returned home as well. Captain Carberry actually returned to service in the U.S. Army as a captain in 1791, and he eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, retiring in 1815 after his service in the War of 1812. Many thought Congress would return to Philadelphia after the mutiny ended, but it did not. Congress remained in Princeton for a few months, but living in a college town was just not working for the delegates, so they decided to move to Annapolis, Maryland. A year later, the Congress briefly moved to Trenton before finally settling in New York City. It remained there until eventually being replaced by the U.S. Congress, which also first met in New York. Congress would return to Philadelphia for a time in the 1790s before finally settling into its permanent home in the new city of Washington, D.C. My book recommendation this week is American Crisis: George Washington and the Dangerous 2 Years After Yorktown, 1781 to 1783, by William M. Fowler, Jr. As the title says, this book covers the final 2 years of the war and much of the disorder caused by the transition to peace. It's a great read. The author, William Fowler, has written several great books on early American history, so if you want to read more about this critical era, read American Crisis by William Fowler. My online recommendation is a journal article called New Light on the Philadelphia Mutiny of 1783 by Kenneth Bowling. It originally appeared in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography in 1977. This article is a really good detailed look at the events described in this week's episode. I've actually included 2 links to this article. One is where you can read it on JSTOR online, but because JSTOR requires a login, the other link is to a PDF article on Penn State's website where you can download the article and read it offline. Both links are available on my blog and website. My question this week asks, if America had lost the War of Independence, would it resemble how it looks today, or would it be more akin to Canada? Well, if the British colonies in America had lost the War of Independence, i.e. the Revolutionary War, not only would America look different, but much of the world would also. And it is likely that the colonies in North America would have eventually obtained independence. The population and wealth just made it too imbalanced for the island of Britain to rule them forever. Now, there probably would have come a time in the 19th century when the British Commonwealth went into effect. The new countries that were created in this Commonwealth, however, would be quite different. We have to remember that the U.S. remained a single country because it knew that cooperation between the states was necessary to maintain independence against foreign European powers. This necessity overcame a great deal of pressure for the states to remain separate. If the states had become independent within a British Commonwealth, where they could rely on the protection of Britain, then they probably would have become separate states. As a result, what is today the U.S. would probably be made up of several dozen countries. Further, those countries would not likely be all English-speaking language countries. The massive immigration and Western expansion that took place after American independence forced many other powers to cede territory to the U.S., particularly the Spanish Empire. If the U.S. had remained British colonies into the 19th century, it's quite likely that that immigration and westward expansion would have been greatly slowed. Britain would have wanted it slowed as a way of keeping peace with the other European powers. The result would be a much larger Spanish presence in Western North America. Possibly the French would have retaken land, and Russia probably would have expanded from Alaska to take more of the continent as well. It may also be unlikely that Canada would be a single country. It became one because it had to compete with the U.S. If there was no U.S., Canada also likely would have broken down into several different countries. The failed revolution also would impact the rest of the Americas. Spanish revolutions in Latin America were inspired by the success of the American Revolution. If the revolution had not succeeded, those Spanish movements for independence probably would have evolved very differently. Europe would probably also be very different. The success of the American Revolution helped inspire the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. If that had evolved differently, Europe would probably look very different today as well. There's also the question of whether Britain would have focused as much on Australia and India if it was still focused on maintaining its North American colony. As history moved on, we'd see even more changes. With a divided North America, we'd likely see more wars between North American states. The U.S. would not have become a single major military power and would not have been much help in the world wars of the 20th century. Likely other major empires or powers would have filled that void. We might see a much more powerful German, Russian, or Japanese empires. Of course, alternative histories can spin out in an infinite number of directions, but the success of the American Revolution pushed much of the world toward the notion that governments should protect liberties and be controlled by the people. That movement has had a major impact on all of world history up until this time. If it had gone a different way, the world undoubtedly would be a very different place today. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.